A desperate farmer walks into a general store and gets humiliated by the town's elite, but then a wealthy widow asks him one question that changes everything. Are you looking for a wife? It sounds like charity, it feels like a trap. But when his farm starts dying and the whole town turns against him, he'll have to decide whether pride matters more than survival. Will he accept her offer or lose everything he has left? Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust came first. It always did in a town like Millridge, where the earth cracked under your boots and the sky pressed down white and merciless from April straight through October. Dust on the porches, dust in the water troughs, dust in your teeth when you tried to smile. Elias Mercer had stopped smiling years ago, so the dust didn't bother him much anymore. What bothered him was the silence, the kind that settled between him and his daughter June on mornings like this, when they had to go into town with empty pockets and even emptier stomachs. June was 12, thin as a willow switch, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She didn't complain. She never complained. That was the worst part. We only need flour and salt, Elias said as they walked down Main Street, the wagon left behind because the horse was too weak to pull it. Maybe some lard if the price is decent. June nodded. She had her hair tied back with a piece of old string, and her dress, pale blue once, gray now, hung loose on her frame. Elias felt the weight of that dress like a stone in his chest. It had been her mother's. He'd cut it down himself with hands better suited to holding a plow than a needle. The general store sat at the corner of Main and Ash, a two-story building with a false front that made it look grander than it was. Through the window, Elias could see the shapes of people inside. The flash of coins on the counter, the easy laughter of folks who didn't count every penny twice before spending it. He stopped at the door. You all right, Pa? June's voice was quiet, careful. Fine, he lied. Then he pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang out like an accusation. The store smelled like coffee and new leather, wood polish, and something sweet he couldn't name. Elias kept his eyes down, moving toward the back where the staples were kept. Flour in burlap sacks, salt in wooden barrels, lard in tin pails. June stayed close to his side, her hand brushing his once, briefly, like she was making sure he was still there. Well, well, a voice said from near the counter. Look who decided to grace us with his presence. Elias didn't have to look up to know who it was. Margaret Dalton, the banker's wife, with a tongue sharp enough to gut a fish and a smile that never reached her eyes. She stood near a display of ribbons, her gloved hand resting on a bolt of yellow silk like she owned it. Maybe she did. Her husband owned just about everything else in Millridge. Mrs. Dalton, Elias said, flat and polite. He reached for a sack of flour, checking the price tag, even though he already knew what it would say. And the girl, too, Margaret continued, her voice rising just enough to carry. My, that dress has seen better days, hasn't it? June's hand found Elias's sleeve. He could feel her fingers tighten, could feel the shame radiating off her like heat from sun-baked stone. He wanted to say something, wanted to tell Margaret Dalton that his daughter was worth 10 of her, that June had more grace in her worn-out shoes than Margaret had in her entire silk-wrapped body. But he didn't. He couldn't afford to. It serves, he said instead, and lifted the flour sack. I'm sure it does. Margaret's laugh was light, musical, cruel. One makes do, doesn't one, when circumstances reduce us to such economies? Another voice joined in, Laura Pine, the mayor's wife, over by the canned goods. Oh, Margaret, don't tease. I'm sure Mr. Mercer is doing his very best. She said it like a compliment, but her eyes said something else entirely. They said, We see you, we know what you are, and we'll never let you forget it. Elias carried the flour to the counter. The storekeeper, a tired man named Gibson, weighed it without meeting his eyes. That was almost worse than the mockery, the pity, the careful avoidance, the way decent people looked past you when you'd fallen too far to climb back up. Salt and lard, too, Elias said. Gibson nodded, moving slow, like he was giving Elias time to change his mind, time to admit he couldn't afford it. Behind them, Margaret's voice floated through the store like poison in well water. I heard the Mercer farm hasn't produced a decent crop in 3 years. Isn't that right, Laura? 4, I think, Laura said. Poor man, and with a child to feed, too. One wonders why he doesn't simply sell, move on to some place where the land isn't quite so unforgiving. Perhaps he's too proud. Pride, Margaret said, and the word dripped with contempt. Yes, I suppose that must be it. June's fingers were digging into his sleeve now. Elias put his hand over hers, squeezed once. Hold on, he wanted to say. Just a little longer. Gibson set the lard and salt on the counter. That'll be $2.40, he said quietly. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small cloth pouch that held everything he had left in the world. He counted out the coins slowly, methodically, each one a small defeat. $2, $2.20, $2.40. The pouch was empty now, completely empty. Thank you, he said, and started gathering the goods. Mr. Mercer. The voice came from the far corner of the store, near the window where the afternoon light came in gold and slanted. Elias turned. A woman stepped out of the shadows there, a woman he'd seen before but never spoken to. Vivian Song. Even in a town as small as Millridge, there were people who existed in their own orbit, separate and untouchable. Vivian was one of them. She lived alone in the big house on Prospect Hill, the one with the iron gates and the rose garden that bloomed even in drought years. People said her late husband had made his fortune in silver, that she'd come from somewhere back east, that she kept to herself because she thought she was too good for Millridge. She wore a dark green dress, simple but fine, with no decoration except a cameo at her throat. Her hair was black, touched with gray at the temples, pulled back in a way that made her face look severe. But her eyes were something else. Dark and steady and completely unafraid. She crossed the store toward him, and the room went quiet. Margaret Dalton's mouth actually fell open. Laura Pine took a step back. Even Gibson froze, a can of peaches suspended in his hand. Vivian stopped 3 feet from Elias. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, and she looked at him the way you'd look at a map you were trying to read, careful, focused, searching for something specific. Mr. Mercer, she said again. Her voice was low, controlled, with an accent he couldn't quite place. I wonder if I might ask you a question. Elias couldn't speak. He couldn't even nod. He just stood there, flour sack in one hand, June pressed against his side, while the whole store held its breath. Vivian's eyes didn't waver. Are you looking for a wife? The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. The wind rattled the store's front window, but inside nothing moved, nothing breathed. Margaret Dalton made a sound like a strangled cat. Laura Pine's hand went to her mouth. Gibson dropped the can of peaches. It hit the floor with a hollow bang and rolled under a shelf. Elias felt June's hand slip from his sleeve, felt the blood drain from his face, then rush back hot and furious. Felt the words pile up in his throat. What? Why? Is this a joke? But none of them would come out. Vivian waited, patient, unmoved. Elias started, then stopped. His voice sounded like a stranger's. I don't understand. It's a simple question, Vivian said. You're a widower. I'm a widow. You have a farm and a daughter. I have a house and means. I'm asking if you're in the market for a wife. This is outrageous, Margaret sputtered. Vivian, have you lost your mind? Vivian didn't even glance at her. Mr. Mercer, I'd like an answer. Elias looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way his late wife Ellen had been beautiful, but there was something in her face that made you want to keep looking, something solid, something real. I can't. He shook his head. This isn't. You don't have to answer now, Vivian said. Think about it. If you decide you'd like to discuss the matter further, you know where I live. She turned to Gibson. Put Mr. Mercer's purchases on my account, please. Now wait just a minute, Elias began, but Vivian raised one hand and the gesture was so calm, so absolute, that he actually stopped talking. Consider it a loan, she said. You can repay me when your circumstances improve, or we can discuss other arrangements. She picked up her own parcels from the counter, tea, sugar, a bolt of white cloth, and walked toward the door. Halfway there, she paused and looked back at him. I'm not joking, Mr. Mercer, and I'm not cruel. Think about it. Then she was gone, the bell ringing behind her, and Elias was left standing in a store full of people who looked at him like he'd just sprouted a second head. Margaret found her voice first. "Well," she said, and it came out half laugh, half gasp. "Well, I never—" "Did you hear that, Laura? Did you hear that?" "Absolutely shameless," Laura breathed. "Propositioning a man in public. And such a man, no offense, Mr. Mercer, but really—" Elias didn't hear the rest. He grabbed the flour, the salt, the lard, and walked out of that store like the building was on fire. June hurried after him, half running to keep up, and they didn't stop until they were 3 blocks away, standing in the shade of an old cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the drought. "Pa," June said. She was breathing hard. "Pa, what just happened?" Elias set the goods down on the ground. His hands were shaking. "I don't know. That lady, Mrs. Song, she asked if you wanted to marry her." "I know what she asked. But why would she do that?" "I don't know, June." He rubbed his face, tried to think. "I don't know. She paid for our food. That wasn't a gift. You heard her. It's a loan. She said you could discuss other arrangements." Junjun's voice was careful, probing. "That means she was serious, doesn't it?" Elias looked at his daughter, at her too thin face and her too old eyes and her dress that had belonged to her dead mother, at the string holding back her hair and the dust on her shoes and the way she was trying so hard to be brave. "It doesn't matter if she was serious," he said. "We're not discussing anything. We're going home." They walked back in silence, the afternoon heat pressing down on them like a hand. The road out of town was rough, rutted from wagon wheels and baked hard by the sun. On both sides, fields stretched away toward distant hills, some planted, some fallow, all of them struggling under the weight of drought. Elias's farm was 3 miles south, 160 acres that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. Good land once, rich soil, reliable creek, enough timber for building and fuel. Now the creek ran dry 6 months out of the year. The soil blew away in dust devils, and the timber was all cut down. The house appeared as they crested a low rise. 1 story, wood frame, painted white a decade ago. The paint was mostly gone now, scoured off by wind and sand. The porch sagged in the middle. 2 windows faced the road, their glass filmed with dust. Behind the house, the barn leaned slightly to the left, and beyond that, the fields lay empty and waiting. Elias had planted wheat this year, 40 acres of it. The seeds had gone into the ground in March, and for a few weeks, he'd let himself hope. The rains had come, light but steady. The shoots had pushed up green and strong. Then the rain stopped. The sun came out and didn't quit, and the wheat withered section by section, row by row, until there was nothing left but brittle stalks and dust. He'd lost crops before. Every farmer did. But this was different. This was the 3rd bad year in a row, and he didn't have the capital for a 4th. The bank held a note on the land, not much, but enough to matter. If he couldn't make the payment come November, they'd take the farm. And then what? Move to Millridge and work for wages? Beg for handouts from people like Margaret Dalton? Die slow or die fast? Those were the choices. June went inside to start supper. Elias stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the barn, the dead fields, the sky that promised nothing but more heat, more dust, more silence. Then he went to the well, drew a bucket of water, and carried it to the small fenced plot behind the house where Ellen was buried. Her stone was simple, just her name and the years, 1889 to 1921. She'd been 32 when the fever took her. Elias had been 35. Now he was 40, and some days he felt twice that. He poured the water over the grave, slow and careful, watching it sink into the earth. Then he sat down on the ground beside the stone and put his head in his hands. "A woman asked me to marry her today," he said quietly. "Rich woman from town, Vivian Song. You remember her? We saw her once at the church social. She wore a purple dress and didn't talk to anyone." The wind moved through the dry grass. "She asked me right there in Gibson's store, in front of Margaret Dalton and half the town. Asked if I was looking for a wife." He laughed, but it came out bitter. "Like I'm a piece of livestock she's thinking about buying." A crow called from somewhere in the distance. I said no. "Well, I didn't say anything, but that's the same as no, isn't it?" He looked at the stone, at Ellen's name carved into the granite. I can't do that, Ellen. Can't marry some stranger just because she's got money and I'm desperate. That's not how it's supposed to work. But even as he said it, he thought about June's dress, about the empty coin pouch in his pocket, about the wheat dying in the field and the payment coming due in November. I don't know what to do, he whispered. I don't know how to keep us alive. The stone didn't answer. It never did. He sat there until the sun started to sink, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red. Then he got up, brushed the dust off his pants, and went inside. June had made cornbread and beans. They ate at the small table by the window, the meal quiet except for the scrape of spoons on tin plates. After, June washed the dishes while Elias sat in his chair by the empty fireplace, trying to read an old newspaper he'd already read 3 times. Pa, June said finally. She was drying the last plate, her back to him. What Mrs. Song said today. About getting married. We're not talking about that. But if you did, we're not. She turned around. Why not? Because it's not right, June. A man doesn't marry for money. But she's not just offering money, is she? She's offering herself too. June set the plate down carefully. She seemed nice, didn't she? Elias folded the newspaper. You don't know her. You don't either. That's exactly my point. Ma always said you were the stubbornest man in 3 counties. Ma, June's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. Ellen's edge, the one that came out when she was right and she knew it. She said you'd rather break than bend. Your mother also said a man's got to have principles. And she'd want you to starve for them, want me to starve. The words hit like a slap. Elias stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. That's not fair. None of this is fair. June's eyes were bright now, not with tears, but with something fiercer. My dying wasn't fair. The crops failing wasn't fair. Those women today saying those things about you, about us, that wasn't fair either. But Mrs. Song, she stood up for you. She paid for our food. She offered you a way out, and you're too proud to even think about it. It's not about pride. Then what is it about? Elias didn't have an answer. Or maybe he had too many answers, all of them tangled up with grief and shame, and the memory of Ellen's hand in his, her voice saying I do under an oak tree with wildflowers in her hair. Go to bed, he said quietly. June stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to the small room at the back of the house, the one that had been meant for a second child that never came. The door closed with a soft click. Elias stood alone in the main room, listening to the night settle around the house. Crickets chirping, the wind rattling the loose board on the porch, the creak and tick of old wood cooling after a hot day. He thought about Vivian Song's question. Are you looking for a wife? He thought about her eyes, steady and unafraid. He thought about June's dress and the empty fields and the payment coming due. And for the first time in 5 years, Elias Mercer let himself imagine a different future. Not a better one, necessarily, just different. It scared him more than the drought ever had. The next morning came hard and bright. Elias woke before dawn, like always, and went out to check on the horse. The animal was old, a gelding named Sam, who'd pulled the plow for 15 years and didn't have many left in him. Elias gave him water and a handful of oats, precious oats, bought on credit from the feed store, and ran a hand along his neck. We're in a fix, old man, he said. Sam's ear flicked. Real bad fix. He spent the morning working on the fence along the north pasture, replacing rotted posts with new ones he'd cut from what was left of the timber stand. It was hard work, mindless work, the kind that let him think without having to admit he was thinking. The sun climbed. Sweat ran down his back. His hands blistered where the old calluses had worn thin. Around noon, June brought him water and a piece of cornbread. She didn't say anything about the night before, and neither did he. They had an agreement, unspoken but solid. Fight at night, forget by morning. It was the only way to survive in a house that small. Mr. Gibson sent a boy by, June said as he drank. Said you left a sack of salt on the counter yesterday. He'll hold it for you. Elias wiped his mouth. I'll pick it up next week. Boy also said folks are talking. Folks are always talking. About you and Mrs. Song. He handed the cup back. Let them talk. June studied him for a moment, then nodded and headed back toward the house. Elias watched her go, this daughter of his who was too young to be so old, and felt the familiar ache in his chest that never quite went away. He worked until the heat drove him into the shade of the barn. There wasn't much left to do there. No animals except Sam, no hay to stack, no equipment to maintain except the plow and a few hand tools. He sat on an overturned bucket and let the shadows cool his skin. That's when he heard the wagon. It came from the east, rattling up the road at a good pace. Elias stood and walked to the barn door, squinting against the sun. The wagon was well made, painted green, pulled by two matched bay horses. And on the seat, reins in hand, was Vivian's song. She pulled up in the yard, set the brake, and climbed down without waiting for help. She wore a gray dress today, practical and plain, with a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face. In the back of the wagon were several wooden crates. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Elias stepped out of the barn. "Mrs. Song, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are." Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Nevertheless, I'm here." "So I see." He crossed his arms. "What do you want?" "To talk." She gestured toward the house. "May I?" "No." "No?" "My daughter's inside. I don't need her getting ideas." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked to the back of the wagon and started pulling out one of the crates. "What are you doing?" Elias demanded. "Unloading." She set the crate on the ground with a thump. "You can help, or you can stand there looking righteous. Your choice." He wanted to tell her to load it back up and leave, wanted to send her and her wagon and her impossible question back to Prospect Hill, where they belonged. But there was something in the way she moved, brisk, efficient, unbothered, that made him curious despite himself. He helped. They unloaded 4 crates total, setting them in the shade of the porch. Then Vivian brushed off her hands and turned to face him. "I upset you yesterday," she said. "You think?" "It wasn't my intention." "Then what was your intention?" She met his eyes. "To make you an offer." "That wasn't an offer. That was a spectacle." "Would you have preferred I come here first? Approached you in private?" She shook her head. "You would have turned me away without hearing me out. At least in town, I had witnesses. You couldn't simply walk away." Elias felt anger flare in his chest. "So you embarrassed me on purpose." "I got your attention. There's a difference." Vivian gestured toward the crates. "These are for June. Fabric, thread, needles. Some books. A few other things a girl her age might need. I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I don't take charity." "It's not charity, it's an investment." "In what?" "In you." Vivian said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're a good man, Mr. Mercer, a hard worker, a devoted father. You've had a run of bad luck, but that doesn't change what you are. I believe in investing in people like you." "You don't know me." "I've watched you for 2 years. I know enough." That stopped him cold. "Watched me?" "Yes." She didn't look embarrassed or apologetic. "You come to town twice a month. You buy only what you need. You treat your daughter with kindness. You don't drink, don't gamble, don't waste time. You're exactly the kind of man this town should value. Instead, they mock you. And you want to rescue me. Is that it?" "No." Vivian's voice sharpened. "I want to make a mutually beneficial arrangement. You need resources. I need companionship. Marriage provides both." "Companionship," Elias repeated. The word tasted strange in his mouth. "Yes." "Not love. Love is a luxury. We're both past the age where luxuries matter more than necessities." He stared at her. "You're serious?" "Completely. You want to marry a man you don't love, who doesn't love you, just so you won't be lonely? And so you won't be destitute, yes." Vivian tilted her head. "Why is that so shocking? People have married for worse reasons since the beginning of time." Elias turned away, looked at his dead fields, his sagging barn, his fading house, thought about June's dress and the banknote and the long, slow slide toward ruin. "I loved my wife," he said quietly. "I know. I'm not looking to replace her. I wouldn't expect you to." "Then what would you expect?" Vivian was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Respect, honesty, partnership. I don't need poetry or grand gestures, Mr. Mercer. I need someone who will sit across the table from me at supper and not make me feel like I'm eating alone. He turned back to look at her. The afternoon light caught the gray in her hair, the lines at the corners of her eyes. She looked tired. Not weak. Vivian Song would never look weak, but tired in a way he recognized, in a way he felt in his own bones. I can't give you an answer, he said. I'm not asking for one today. Then when? When you're ready. She walked back to her wagon, climbed up onto the seat. The offer stands, Mr. Mercer. Think about it. And take care of those books. They belong to my late husband. He would have liked June. She drove away before he could respond, the wagon rattling back down the road in a cloud of dust. Elias stood in the yard for a long time after she left. Then he went to the porch and opened the first crate. Inside were bolts of fabric, blue cotton, green calico, white muslin, needles in a small tin box, thread in every color. And at the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, 3 books, Little Women, Treasure Island, and a collection of poetry by someone named Whitman. June appeared in the doorway. What's all this? Elias closed the crate. Nothing. It doesn't look like nothing. Mrs. Song brought it. For you. June's eyes widened. For me? Why? I don't know. He stood up, brushed dust from his pants. Leave it. We'll send it back. But I said leave it, June. But that night, after June had gone to bed, Elias sat in his chair and opened one of the books. Leaves of Grass, the cover said. He turned to a random page and read, I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars. He closed the book carefully and set it aside. Then he sat in the dark and tried not to think about Vivian Song's tired eyes, or her quiet voice, or the way she'd said companionship like it was something holy. He tried. He failed. And somewhere in the long hours before dawn, Elias Mercer began to understand that the question she'd asked in the store wasn't really a question at all. It was a door. And he had to decide whether to walk through it or not. The books sat on the kitchen table for 3 days like accusations. June circled them the way a cat circles something it doesn't trust, curious, wary, wanting to touch, but not quite daring. Elias pretended not to notice. He spent his mornings working the fence line, his afternoons in the barn fixing things that didn't need fixing, his evenings staring at the wall while June made supper from the same dwindling supplies they'd been stretching since spring. On the 4th day, he came in from the fields and found her reading. She sat in the window seat Ellen had insisted he build the first year they were married, knees pulled up, the book open against her legs. Little Women. Her lips moved slightly as she read, the way they always did when she was concentrating hard. She didn't look up when he came in. Thought I told you to leave those alone, Elias said. June's eyes didn't leave the page. You said to leave the crates. You didn't say anything about the books. June, it's about sisters, she said quietly. 4 of them. They're poor, but they have each other, and their mother loves them something fierce. She turned a page. I wish I had a sister. Elias felt something twist in his chest. He and Ellen had tried for more children after June. 3 pregnancies, 3 losses. The last one had nearly killed Ellen. After that, they'd stopped trying. Stopped hoping. You've got me, he said. I know. June finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she wasn't crying. I just mean, it'd be nice not to be alone so much. You're not alone. You're always working, Pa, and when you're not working, you're thinking about working, or thinking about Ma, or just thinking. She closed the book carefully, ran her hand over the cover. This book, these sisters, they talk to each other. They laugh, they fight, and make up and laugh again. When's the last time we laughed? Elias opened his mouth, closed it, couldn't remember. June stood up and carried the book to her room without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and Elias was left standing in the kitchen with the last of the daylight coming through the window, throwing long shadows across the floor. That night, he dreamed of Ellen. Not the way she'd been at the end, fever-bright and fading, but the way she'd been when they were young. They were standing in a field of wheat, tall and golden. And she was laughing at something he'd said. The sound of it filled the whole sky. He reached for her hand, But when he touched her, she turned to dust and blew away in the wind. He woke gasping, sweat-soaked, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was dark and still. Through the thin wall, he could hear June's breathing, slow and steady, safe, alive. He didn't sleep again that night. By the end of the week, word had spread through Millridge like cholera. Everywhere Elias went, the feed store, the post office, the street corners where men gathered to smoke and lie about their crops, people stared, some whispered, some didn't bother to lower their voices. Heard Vivian's songs got her eye on that Mercer fellow. Buying him, more like. Can't blame a man for wanting to better his situation. Can if he's got any pride left. Elias kept his head down and his mouth shut. He'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself just gave people more to talk about. Let them say what they wanted. Words couldn't kill you. Words couldn't take your land or starve your daughter. But they could make you feel small. And some days, Elias felt about as small as a man could get. He was at the feed store paying for a bag of chicken scratch on credit he couldn't afford when he ran into Thomas Brennan. Tom had a farm 5 miles west. Good land with a reliable well and soil that actually grew things. He'd been friends with Elias once, back when friendship was a thing Elias had time for. "Elias," Tom said, not unkindly, "how you holding up?" "Fine. Heard about your wheat." "Everyone's heard about my wheat." Tom shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Look, I know things are tight for you right now. If you need work, I could use a hand during harvest. Pays not much, but it's something." Elias felt his jaw tighten. Charity dressed up as opportunity. "I've got my own harvest to worry about." "What harvest?" Tom said it gently, but the words still cut. "Elias, come on. Be reasonable. You can't squeeze blood from a stone." "Watch me. It's not about—" Tom stopped, lowered his voice. "Is it true? About Vivian's song?" "I don't know what you heard." "I heard she proposed to you right there in Gibson's store." Elias picked up his bag of chicken scratch. "Then you heard right. And nothing. It's none of your business." "You're really considering it." Tom sounded amazed. "You're actually thinking about marrying her." "I didn't say that." "You didn't say you weren't." Elias turned to face him fully. "What do you want me to say, Tom? That I'm too proud to take help? That I'd rather starve than marry a woman I don't love? Would that make you feel better? Make me look like some kind of hero?" Tom raised his hands. "I'm not judging you." "Yes, you are. Everyone is." Elias hefted the bag onto his shoulder. "Difference is, you're all standing on solid ground while I'm sinking. Easy to judge from up there." He walked out before Tom could respond, the door banging shut behind him. The trip home was long and hot and angry. Elias walked faster than he needed to, like he could outpace his own thoughts. But they followed him anyway, circling like buzzards. "You're actually thinking about marrying her." Was he? He didn't know. Every time he tried to think it through logically, his mind skittered away like a spooked horse. Marriage was supposed to be about love, about choosing someone because you couldn't imagine life without them. That's what he'd had with Ellen. That's what marriage was supposed to be. But Ellen was dead, and June needed new dresses, and the banknote was coming due, and Vivian's song had looked at him like he was worth something. When he got home, June was in the yard, hanging laundry on the line they'd strung between 2 posts. She'd washed her own dress, the faded blue one, and it hung there dripping onto the dust. Next to it was a new dress, one she'd made from the fabric Vivian had brought, green calico with white buttons. It looked almost cheerful in the harsh sunlight. "You made that?" Elias asked. June nodded, not looking at him. "Needed something that fit proper." "It's nice." "Thank you." She pinned up a dishcloth. "Mrs. Song came by while you were gone." Elias set the chicken scratch down harder than he meant to. "What did she want?" "To talk to you. I told her you'd be back soon, but she said she couldn't wait." June pulled another cloth from the basket. "She invited us to supper, tomorrow night, at her house." "No." "Pa, I said no." June turned to face him, her hand still holding the wet cloth. "She was kind to me. She asked about my reading, about what I was making with the fabric. She didn't talk down to me or pat my head like I was a dog. She treated me like I mattered." "You do matter. Then why won't you even consider what she's offering? Because it's not right. Says who? June's voice rose. Says the town that laughs at us? Says the people who cross the street so they don't have to talk to us? Says the banker who's going to take our home come November? June, that's enough. No, it's not enough. Nothing's ever enough. You work yourself half to death, and it's not enough. I go without, and it's not enough. We pray and hope and try, and it's still not enough. She threw the cloth back into the basket. Maybe Mrs. Song is enough. Maybe she's exactly enough. But you're too stubborn to see it. She ran into the house before Elias could respond. The door slammed. Through the window, he could see her shadow move across the wall, could hear the faint sound of crying. He stood in the yard, looking at that green dress swaying in the breeze, and felt like the worst father who'd ever lived. That evening, he didn't eat, didn't sit in his chair or pretend to read the newspaper. He went to Ellen's grave and sat there as the sun went down, his back against the headstone, his hat in his hands. She's right, he said to the gathering darkness. June's right. I am stubborn. You always said so. He turned the hat in his hands, feeling the worn places where the brim had bent. But I don't know how to do this, Ellen. Don't know how to marry someone I don't love. Don't know how to stand next to another woman and call her my wife. The crickets started up, their song filling the empty spaces. She's lonely, he continued. Vivian, I can see it in her. Same kind of lonely that's eating me alive. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we need. Two lonely people deciding to be lonely together. He laughed, but it came out broken. Doesn't sound like much of a marriage, does it? A coyote called from somewhere far off, long and mournful. I'm going to lose the farm, Elias said quietly. You know that, don't you? Come November, the bank's going to take it. And then what? Where do we go? What do I tell June when we're living in some boarding house in town, and I'm breaking my back for wages that won't feed us both? He sat there until the stars came out, cold and bright and indifferent. Then he went inside, found June already asleep with tear tracks on her cheeks, and made a decision that terrified him more than anything had in 5 years. The next morning, he shaved, put on his Sunday shirt, the one with the frayed collar that Ellen had mended so many times. The fabric was more thread than cloth, combed his hair with water from the basin, looked at himself in the cracked mirror over the washstand and barely recognized the man staring back. We're going to supper tonight, he told June at breakfast. She looked up from her oatmeal, eyes wide. At Mrs. Song's? Yes. You mean it? I mean it. Elias stirred his coffee, watching the ground swirl. But this doesn't mean anything's decided. Understand? We're just going to supper. June nodded, but her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been in months. They spent the day cleaning up. June washed her hair in the basin, worked the tangles out with Ellen's old comb, put on the green dress and the shoes Elias had managed to buy her last Christmas. Too big then, almost too small now. Elias put on his only pair of trousers without patches, his boots that were held together more by hope than leather. At 5 o'clock, they started walking. Prospect Hill sat on the eastern edge of Mill Ridge, a gentle rise that gave way to a view of the valley and the mountains beyond. The songhouse crowned it like something out of a storybook. 2 stories, white clapboard, black shutters, a wraparound porch with actual paint on it. The iron gate was open, and the path leading up to the house was lined with roses. Red ones, pink ones, white ones that glowed in the late afternoon light. Elias stopped at the gate. His mouth had gone dry. It's beautiful, June whispered. It was. It was also terrifying. This house, this woman, this whole impossible situation. Elias wanted to turn around, go home, forget any of this had ever happened. But June was already walking up the path, her hand trailing along the roses, her face turned toward the house like it was the sun. And Elias couldn't call her back, couldn't take that look off her face, so he followed. Vivian opened the door before they reached the porch. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, with her hair loose around her shoulders. It made her look younger, softer, almost approachable. Mr. Mercer, she said. June, I'm so glad you came. Thank you for having us, June said, her voice small but polite. Vivian smiled. Come in, please. The inside of the house was even more overwhelming than the outside. Hardwood floors that gleamed, furniture that looked like it had never been sat on, paintings on the walls, actual paintings in frames. a chandelier hanging in the front hall with crystals that caught the light and threw rainbows across the ceiling. June made a small sound, wonder and longing mixed together. "Your home is lovely," Elias managed. "Thank you." Vivian closed the door behind them. "It's too big for one person. I've always thought that." She gestured toward the back of the house. "Come. Supper's almost ready." The dining room had a table that could seat 12, but Vivian had set only 3 places, all clustered at one end. The china was white with blue flowers. The silver gleamed. In the center of the table, a vase held fresh roses. "I hope you like roast chicken," Vivian said. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage the basics." "It smells wonderful," June said. They sat. Vivian served chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans from her garden, bread that was still warm from the oven, butter, real butter, not lard, water in crystal glasses. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. They just ate, the silence broken only by the clink of silverware and the distant sound of birds settling in for the evening. Then Vivian said, "June, your father tells me you've been reading." June glanced at Elias, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, the books you brought. I finished Little Women already." "Already? That's impressive." "I didn't want to stop." June's voice grew stronger. "It was like the girls were real, like I could hear them talking." "That's the mark of good writing," Vivian said. "When the characters become people you know." "Did you read it when you were young?" "I did, many times." Vivian smiled. A real smile. Not the careful, polite things she showed the world. "I always wanted to be Joe, the writer. But I suspect I was more like Meg, trying to be proper when all I wanted was to run wild." June laughed. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was like. They talked about books through the rest of the meal. Vivian asked June what she wanted to read next, promised to lend her more from her library upstairs. June asked Vivian where she was from, and Vivian told stories about growing up in Philadelphia, about moving west with her husband, about learning to love the open sky even though it still scared her sometimes. Elias mostly listened, watched his daughter come alive across the table, watched Vivian's face soften as she talked. This woman who'd stood in Gibson's store and asked him an impossible question wasn't what he'd expected. She wasn't hard or cold or calculating. She was just lonely, like June said. Like he was. After supper, Vivian showed June the library, a whole room lined with books, floor to ceiling. June stood in the doorway, speechless. "Take whatever you'd like," Vivian said. "I mean it. Books are meant to be read, not just looked at." June disappeared into the shelves, running her fingers along the spines, whispering titles to herself. Vivian turned to Elias. "Walk with me?" They went out to the garden, the evening air cool and sweet. The roses seemed to glow in the fading light. Somewhere, a mockingbird was singing. "Thank you," Elias said finally. "For supper? For the books? For being kind to June." "I wasn't being kind. I like her." Vivian stopped beside a rose bush, touched one of the blooms. "She reminds me of myself at that age. Smart, but trying to hide it. Lonely, but pretending she's not." "She is lonely. So are you." Elias didn't deny it. Couldn't. Vivian looked at him. "I know what people are saying, that I'm trying to buy you, that you're too desperate to say no, that this whole thing is some kind of transaction. Isn't it?" "Partly. I won't lie to you, Mr. Mercer. I'm not offering romance. I'm too old for romance. But I am offering something real. A partnership. A home. Companionship." She paused. "And I think you need all of those things as much as I do." "What makes you think I'd be any good at it? Being a husband to you?" "Because you were a good husband before. I watched you with your wife the few times I saw you together. You treated her with respect. You listened when she spoke. You didn't try to make her smaller, to make yourself bigger." Vivian's voice went quiet. "My husband was a good man, but he never listened. He talked, I smiled, and that was our marriage. I don't want that again." "What do you want?" "Someone who sees me. Someone who sits across the table and doesn't make me feel invisible." She met his eyes. "I think you could do that, and I think I could do the same for you." Elias looked at this woman, this strange, serious, lonely woman, and felt something shift inside him. Not love, nothing that simple, but recognition, understanding, like looking at someone and seeing your own reflection staring back. I don't know if I can do this, he said honestly. I'm not asking you to know. I'm asking you to try. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have failed honestly, together. Vivian touched his arm, brief and light. But I don't think it will fail, Mr. Mercer. I think we're both too practical for that. They stood in the garden as the sky darkened, the mockingbird still singing, the roses breathing perfume into the air. Elias thought about his dead fields and June's thin face, and the banknote, and the long cold winter coming. Thought about sitting at his table alone, eating beans in silence. Thought about Vivian's library and her quiet voice and the way she'd made June laugh. If I said yes, he began slowly, if I agreed to this, what would you expect? What would the arrangement look like? You and June would move here. The farm could be sold or rented or kept, whatever you prefer. You'd have your own room, at least at first. No expectations beyond companionship and conversation. Vivian's voice was steady, businesslike. I'd provide for June's education, her clothing, her future. You'd manage the property, the grounds, the business investments. We'd be partners in all things. And the town? The town can think what it likes. Vivian smiled sharp and cold. They've never liked me anyway. One more thing for them to whisper about won't make a difference. Elias took a breath. Let it out. I need time. Take all you need. But not much. I need to decide soon. I understand. They walked back to the house together. June was in the library, 3 books stacked in her arms, her face flushed and happy. She looked at Elias and he saw the question in her eyes. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 5 years, he thought he might find one. They left as the stars came out, June clutching her books, Vivian standing on the porch to see them off. At the gate, Elias turned back. Vivian was still there, framed by lamplight from the windows, her hand raised in farewell. She's nice, Pa, June said as they walked home. Really nice. I know. The house is beautiful. I know. And she has so many books. I noticed. June was quiet for a moment, then softly, would it be so bad? Marrying her? Elias looked up at the stars, at the vast empty sky. I don't know, sweetheart. I honestly don't know. But that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Elias let himself imagine it, living in that house, sitting at that table every night, having conversations that weren't just about survival, watching June read books from an actual library instead of the same 3 volumes they owned, being seen, being heard, being something other than alone. It wouldn't be love, Vivian was right about that, but maybe it didn't have to be. Maybe there were other things that mattered just as much. Maybe he'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd forgotten to look at what he might still gain. The thought kept him awake until dawn. The morning after the supper, Elias woke to find June already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with one of Vivian's books open in front of her. She looked up when he came in, her expression careful. Thought you'd sleep longer, she said. Couldn't. He went to the stove, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made. It was weak. They were stretching the grounds, but hot. What are you reading? Treasure Island. It's about a boy who goes looking for pirate gold. She traced a finger along a line of text. He's brave, braver than I'd be. Elias sat down across from her. You're plenty brave. I'm not brave. I'm just here. June closed the book. Pa, are you going to marry her? The question sat between them like something physical. Elias wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, felt the heat of it seep into his palms. I don't know yet. But you're thinking about it. I'm thinking about a lot of things. June leaned forward. I liked her house. I liked her. She wasn't what I expected. What did you expect? Someone mean, I guess. Someone who looked down on us. But she didn't. She talked to me like I was a real person, not just some kid. June's voice went soft. And she was lonely, Pa. I could tell. The way she kept looking at the empty chairs at the table. The way she smiled when we talked, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She's got everything. Money, that beautiful house, all those books, but she's still lonely. Money doesn't fix everything. I know that. I just mean, maybe you could fix each other. A little bit. Elias looked at his daughter, this girl who was too young to be so wise, and felt his heart crack. When did you grow up? When Ma died. June said it matter of fact, without self-pity. Someone had to. They sat in silence for a while, the morning light creeping across the floor. Then June went back to her book, and Elias went out to tend to Sam and check the fields that weren't really fields anymore, just stretches of dust and dead stalks. He didn't go into town that week. Didn't want to hear the whispers or see the looks. But on Saturday, Thomas Brennan rode out to the farm, his horse kicking up dust on the dry road. "Elias," Tom called from the yard. "Got a minute?" Elias set down the bucket he'd been carrying, empty because the well was running lower every day, and walked over. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom dismounted, tied his horse to the porch rail. He looked uncomfortable, kept adjusting his hat. "Wanted to apologize for what I said at the feed store. Wasn't my place." "No, it wasn't, but I also wanted to warn you." Tom glanced toward the house, lowered his voice. "People are talking, Elias, and not just talking, they're angry." "About what?" "My business is my business." "Not when it involves Vivian's song." Tom pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "Look, you know how this town is. They've never liked her. Foreign woman, coming in with money, keeping to herself, and now she's making a play for one of their own. I'm hardly one of their own. They've made that pretty clear. You were born here. Your family's been here for generations. That counts for something." Tom put his hat back on. "What I'm saying is, if you go through with this, if you marry her, it's going to get worse. For both of you." "Worse than starving?" "Maybe. Yeah." Tom met his eyes. "Margaret Dalton's been saying things about how Vivian's trying to buy herself a place in decent society, how you're selling yourself like, well, she's using words I won't repeat in front of your daughter." Elias felt anger rise in his throat, hot and bitter. "Let her say what she wants. It's not just her. The mayor's wife, the reverend's wife, half the women in town. They're circling like wolves." Tom shifted his weight. "And the men aren't much better. They're saying if you marry her, you won't be welcome at the feed store, the bank, anywhere. They'll freeze you out." "Then I'll go somewhere else." "There is nowhere else, Elias. This is it. This is the only town for 50 miles. Tom's voice turned urgent. "I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to tell you what you're walking into. And I appreciate that." Elias crossed his arms. "But my choices are pretty simple, Tom. I can marry Vivian and deal with whatever the town throws at me. Or I can watch my daughter go hungry while the bank takes my land. Those are my options. So unless you've got a third one hiding in your back pocket, I'd appreciate you leaving me to make my own decisions." Tom stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You always were stubborn. So I've been told. Just be careful. That's all I'm saying." Tom untied his horse, swung up into the saddle. "And if you need anything, I won't." Tom rode off without another word, and Elias stood in the yard watching him go, watching the dust settle behind him. Through the window he could see June pretending not to listen. She met his eyes, and he saw the question there again. That afternoon, he walked to Ellen's grave, sat down in the dust and talked to the headstone like it could hear him. "They're saying I'm selling myself," he told her, Margaret Dalton and the rest. "Saying Vivian's buying a husband like you'd buy a horse or a plow." He pulled up a handful of dry grass, let it sift through his fingers. "Maybe they're right. Maybe that's exactly what this is. A transaction, money for companionship, security for... what? My soul?" The wind moved through the dead wheat, making a sound like whispers. "But here's the thing, Ellen. I don't think I care anymore." He looked at the stone, at her name carved into the granite. "I'm tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of pretending I can do this alone. And June, she liked Vivian, really liked her. Saw something in her that I'm just starting to see." He paused. "Would you hate me if I did this? If I married someone I don't love because it's the practical thing to do?" A crow landed on the fence post nearby, cocked its head at him. "You always said I thought too much with my heart. Maybe it's time I used my head instead." Elias stood up, brushed the dust from his pants. "I hope you'd understand. I hope wherever you are, You'd see I'm trying to take care of our girl the only way I know how." He walked back to the house, and when June asked him if he was all right, he told her yes. It was a lie, but a necessary one. That night, he made his decision. The next morning, he put on his Sunday clothes again, told June to stay home, and walked to Prospect Hill. The roses were in full bloom, red and pink and white, their scent thick in the air. He stood at the gate for a full minute, gathering his courage. Then he walked up the path and knocked on the door. Vivian answered. She wore a simple gray dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except the cameo at her throat. When she saw him, something flickered in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. "Mr. Mercer, I need to talk to you," he said. "Of course. Come in." She led him to a sitting room he hadn't seen during the supper visit. Smaller than the dining room, more comfortable. Books on the shelves, a piano in the corner, windows that looked out over the garden. She gestured to a chair, but Elias stayed standing. "I've been thinking," he started, "about your offer." Vivian folded her hands in her lap. And I have questions. A lot of them. Ask. Why me? The words came out harder than he meant them to. You're educated, wealthy, could have your pick of men. Why choose someone like me? Someone with nothing to offer except debt and a failing farm. Vivian didn't flinch. Because men with something to offer don't see me, Mr. Mercer. They see my money, my house, the connections they think I have. They don't see me. And I do? You did. That first time we met at the church social 3 years ago. You looked at me like I was a person, not a curiosity. You nodded, said good afternoon, and moved on. You didn't stare, didn't whisper, didn't treat me like I was some exotic bird in a cage. She stood up, moved to the window. Everyone else in this town looks at me and sees foreign, or widow, or rich woman. You just saw another person at a church social. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Elias remembered that day vaguely. Ellen had been alive then, weak but still fighting. They'd gone to the social because she'd insisted, said she wanted to see people, be normal for an afternoon. He'd been so focused on her, making sure she was comfortable, that he barely noticed anyone else. I was worried about my wife, he said. I know. That's what made it remarkable. Vivian turned to face him. You were so focused on her comfort, her happiness, that you treated everyone else, including me, with basic decency without even thinking about it. That's the kind of man I want to marry, Mr. Mercer. Someone who treats people like people. I'm not a saint, Mrs. Song. I don't want a saint. Saints are exhausting. A small smile touched her lips. I want a partner, someone practical, someone who won't lie to me about what this is. And what is this? An arrangement that benefits us both. I get companionship. You get security. We both get someone to sit across the table from. She crossed the room, stopped a few feet from him. I won't ask you to love me, Mr. Mercer. I won't even ask you to pretend. All I ask is honesty, respect, and your presence. Can you give me that? Elias looked at this woman who'd turned his life upside down with one question in a general store, looked at her serious face and her steady eyes and her hands that didn't shake even though he could see the tension in her shoulders. I can try, he said. Vivian's breath went out of her in a rush. That's all I'm asking. But I have conditions. Name them. June comes first, always. Her education, her future, her happiness. Those are non-negotiable. Agreed. And the farm. I'm not ready to sell it. Not yet. I know it's not worth much, but it's been in my family for 3 generations. I need time to figure out what to do with it. Take all the time you need. And we do this properly. I won't have people saying I snuck up here in the middle of the night. We'll post the banns, have a proper wedding, whatever needs doing to make it legitimate. Of course. Elias took a breath. And if either of us realizes this was a mistake, we end it. No hard feelings, no obligations beyond what's fair. Vivian extended her hand. Deal. He shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm cool and dry. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, sealing an arrangement that was part business deal, part desperate gamble, part something neither of them had words for yet. When? Vivian asked. Soon, before I lose my nerve. 2 weeks? Make it 3. Gives people time to get used to the idea. They're not going to get used to it, Mr. Mercer. Then gives them time to say whatever they're going to say and get it out of their system. He released her hand. I'll tell June today. You tell whoever needs to know. The Reverend, the courthouse clerk. Vivian's mouth quirked. Margaret Dalton, just to watch her face turn purple. Elias almost smiled. Almost. He left the house feeling like he'd just signed his life away. Maybe he had. But as he walked back down the hill, past the roses and the iron gate, he thought about June reading in that library, thought about eating real food at a real table, thought about not being alone in that house every night with nothing but ghosts for company. Maybe it wouldn't be love, but maybe it would be enough. June was waiting for him on the porch when he got home. She didn't ask, just looked at him with those dark eyes that saw too much. I'm going to marry her, Elias said. June's face broke into the first real smile he'd seen in years. Really? 3 weeks from today. She threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him over. Thank you, Pa. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This might be the worst decision I've ever made. Or the best. June pulled back, still smiling. When do we move? After the wedding. Can I bring my books? You can bring whatever you want, sweetheart. That night, June hummed while she made supper. Hummed. Elias couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her hum. The sound filled the small kitchen, pushed back the silence that had lived there for 5 years. He sat at the table and listened and felt something in his chest unclench just a little. But the next day, when they went into town to post the banns, the backlash started. They'd barely walked into the courthouse when the clerk, a thin man named Peters, who'd gone to school with Elias's father, looked up from his desk and frowned. Elias Mercer, what brings you here? Need to post marriage bans. Peters set down his pen. Marriage bans. That's right. For you. Yes. And who's the lucky lady? Elias felt his jaw tighten. Vivian's song. The silence that followed was profound. Peter stared at him like he'd just announced he was marrying a mule. Then, slowly, his face twisted into something ugly. You're serious. Wouldn't be here if I wasn't. Elias, you can't... Peter stopped, seemed to gather himself. Look, I know times are hard for you, but this is unseemly. That woman, she doesn't belong here. She's lived here for 6 years. That doesn't make her one of us. Peter stood up. And you, marrying her for her money, that makes you... Careful. Elias's voice went flat and dangerous. You finish that sentence, we're going to have a problem. Peters's mouth snapped shut, but his eyes were full of contempt. Just post the bans, Elias said. That's your job, isn't it? It is. Peters pulled out the necessary forms, slapped them down on the counter. But don't expect congratulations. Don't expect anyone in this town to celebrate this arrangement. I don't expect anything from this town except what I pay for. Elias filled out the forms, his handwriting careful and deliberate. When he was done, he pushed them back across the counter. There. That's legal, isn't it? Peters looked at the forms like they were covered in filth. It's legal. Good. They walked out into the morning sun, and Elias felt June's hand slip into his. She was trembling. It's all right, he told her. They hate us. They hated us before. This just gives them a reason to be honest about it. But it got worse. By afternoon, the whole town knew, and by evening, the whispers had turned into open hostility. Elias went to Gibson's store for supplies, and the storekeeper refused to sell to him. Sorry, Elias, Gibson said, not looking sorry at all. But I can't serve you anymore. Why not? Because Mrs. Dalton and the other ladies, they said if I keep doing business with you, they'll take their custom elsewhere. And I can't afford that. I've been coming here for 20 years. I know, and I'm sorry, but business is business. Elias left empty-handed. Tried the feed store next, got the same response. Even the bakery where June used to go for day-old bread, turned them away. This is wrong, June whispered as they walked home. They can't do this. They can do whatever they want. Elias kept his voice steady, but inside he was shaking with rage. We'll manage. How? He didn't have an answer. That night, someone threw a rock through their window. It shattered the glass, sent shards flying across the floor. Wrapped around the rock was a piece of paper with one word written on it. Whore. June picked it up, read it, and went pale. Elias took the paper from her hands, crumpled it, threw it in the stove. "Pack your things," he said. "What?" "Pack your things. We're leaving tonight." "But the wedding isn't for 3 weeks." Plans changed. He was already moving, grabbing their few possessions, stuffing them into a burlap sack. "We're not staying here another night." "Where will we go?" "Vivian's." He stopped, looked at his daughter. "Unless you want to stay. If you're having second thoughts." "I'm not." June's voice was firm. "I'm scared, but I'm not having second thoughts." "Good. Then pack." They worked quickly, silently. Didn't take much. They didn't have much to take. Clothes, books, a few kitchen things. Ellen's wedding ring, which Elias had kept in a tin box under the bed. The photograph of Ellen and him on their wedding day, the edges worn from handling. By the time they finished, it was full dark. Elias hitched Sam to the wagon, one last time, he thought, and loaded their belongings. June climbed up beside him, and they rolled out of the yard without looking back. The road to Prospect Hill was rough in the darkness, but Sam knew the way. Elias kept the reins loose, let the horse set the pace. Beside him, June was quiet, her hands folded in her lap. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know." Her voice was small. "Everything's happening so fast." "I know." "Are you scared?" He thought about lying, decided against it. "Terrified." "Me too." They crested the hill, and the songhouse came into view, every window lit. Vivian must have seen them coming because she was on the porch before they reached the gate, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Mr. Mercer," she called. "What's wrong?" Elias pulled the wagon to a stop. "Can we come in?" "Of course. What happened?" "Everything." He climbed down, helped June. "Someone threw a rock through our window. The stores won't serve us. And I realized I don't want to wait 3 weeks. I don't want to give them 3 more weeks to make our lives hell." Vivian looked at him, then at June, then at the wagon loaded with their few possessions. "You want to move in tonight?" "If you'll have us." "And the wedding?" "We'll figure that out, but I'm not going back to that house. Not after tonight." Vivian nodded slowly. Then she turned and called into the house. "Mrs. Chen, we have guests, permanent guests. Prepare the east bedroom and the one next to it." A voice answered from inside, an older woman's voice, speaking with an accent Elias couldn't place. "Come in," Vivian said, gesturing them forward. "Both of you. You're safe here." Elias and June unloaded the wagon while Vivian directed a small Chinese woman who appeared from somewhere in the back of the house. Mrs. Chen, Vivian explained, managed the household. She'd been with Vivian since Philadelphia. She didn't say much, but her hands were gentle as she helped June carry books upstairs. The east bedroom was 3 times the size of June's room at the farm. It had a real bed with a quilt, a wardrobe, a desk by the window. June stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. "Is this really for me?" she asked. "It's yours," Vivian said, "for as long as you want it." The room next to it was smaller, but still larger than anything Elias had ever slept in. It had a bed, a chair, a small table, a window that looked out over the garden. "This is temporary," Vivian said, until we decide otherwise." Elias understood. Separate rooms, separate lives, an arrangement, not a marriage. Not yet. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me." Vivian touched his arm briefly. "You're doing me as much a favor as I'm doing you." Mrs. Chen made tea. They sat in the kitchen, a huge room with a cast-iron stove and cupboards full of food, and drank it while June slowly stopped shaking. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, but inside it was warm and bright and safe. "We'll get married this week," Vivian said. "No bands, no ceremony, just a trip to the courthouse with witnesses." "The whole town will lose their minds," Elias said. "Let them." Vivian's eyes were hard. "They've made their position clear. Now we make ours." And sitting in that warm kitchen, drinking tea with this strange woman who'd saved him without asking for anything he couldn't give, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. And for now, that was enough. They were married on a Thursday morning in the courthouse, with Mrs. Chen and the clerk Peters as witnesses. Peters looked like he'd swallowed glass, but he signed the certificate when Vivian slid it across the counter. The Reverend had refused to perform the ceremony, said it went against his conscience to marry people who were making a mockery of holy matrimony. So they'd gone to the judge instead, a gray-haired man named Walsh, who asked no questions and showed no judgment. "By the power vested in me by the state," Walsh said in a monotone, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss, no music, no celebration, just signatures on paper and the scrape of chairs as they all stood up. "Congratulations," Walsh said without enthusiasm, and that was that. They walked out into the morning sun as husband and wife, legally bound, practically strangers. June waited for them on the courthouse steps, wearing a new dress Vivian had made for her, yellow cotton with lace at the collar. She looked nervous and hopeful in equal measure. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's done," Vivian said. June hugged Elias first, then Vivian. The older woman stiffened for a moment, surprised, before her arms came up to return the embrace. When they pulled apart, Vivian's eyes were bright. "Well then," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Shall we go home?" Home. The word felt strange in Elias's mouth, but he nodded. They climbed into Vivian's wagon, his wagon now too, he supposed, and drove back up to Prospect Hill while the town watched from windows and doorways. Let them watch. Let them talk. It was done now. The first week was the hardest. Elias moved through the house like a ghost, uncertain where he belonged. The rooms were too large, the furniture too fine, the silence too different from the silence he'd known. At the farm, silence had been empty. Here it felt full of things unsaid, questions unasked, a future that stretched out uncertain and strange. He slept in his own room with the door closed. Vivian slept in hers. They met for meals, exchanged pleasantries, then retreated to their separate corners. It was civil. It was polite. It was absolutely suffocating. June seemed to be the only one who fit. She spent her days in the library, reading everything she could get her hands on. Mrs. Chen taught her to cook properly, showed her how to make dumplings and steam fish, and prepare rice that didn't stick to the pot. In the evenings, she'd sit with Vivian and talk about books, about ideas, about things Elias had never thought to discuss with her. He felt useless, unnecessary, a man without a purpose. On the third day, he went back to the farm. He hadn't told anyone he was going, just saddled Sam early in the morning and rode out while the house was still quiet. The road was familiar, every rut and turn memorized from 20 years of traveling it. But when he crested the final rise and saw the house sitting there in the dust, something in his chest twisted. It looked abandoned already. The broken window gaped like a missing tooth. The porch sagged lower than he remembered. The fields stretched away empty and accusing. He dismounted, walked through the rooms he'd shared with Ellen. Someone had been here, probably scavengers from town. The few things they'd left behind were scattered, broken. Ellen's good plates, the ones she'd gotten from her mother, were smashed on the kitchen floor. The chair he'd built for June's second birthday was overturned, one leg snapped off. Elias stood in the middle of the kitchen and tried to feel something. Anger, grief, anything. But there was just numbness, cold and heavy. He walked out to Ellen's grave. The stone was still there, untouched. He sat down beside it and pulled the weeds that had grown up around the base. "I married her," he said quietly. 3 days ago. It was the least romantic thing you can imagine. No flowers, no music, just paperwork and a judge who looked bored. He pulled another weed. "I'm living in her house now. June's happy. Happier than she's been since you died. But me? I don't know what I am." The wind moved through the dead wheat, the same sound it had been making for months. "I feel like I'm waiting for something, like this is all temporary and any minute now I'll wake up and be back here, struggling to make ends meet, alone." He looked at the stone. "Maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe this is all too good to be real." A shadow fell across him. Elias looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun. Thomas Brennan stood there, his hat in his hands. "Thought I might find you here." Elias stood up slowly. "Tom, heard you got married. Heard you moved up to the song place." Tom shifted his weight. "Wanted to check on you." "I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you're at a funeral." "Maybe I am." Elias gestured at the farm, the house, the empty fields. This is all dead, Tom. Has been for a while. I'm just finally admitting it. Tom looked around, his expression sad. What are you going to do with it? Don't know yet. Can't sell it? Who'd buy it? Can't work it? There's no water. Elias shook his head. Might just let it go back to dust. Let the bank take it if they want it badly enough. That's 3 generations of Mercers you're giving up. And what good did it do them? My grandfather broke his back on this land. My father died young trying to make it profitable. I spent 20 years fighting the same fight. Elias's voice went hard. Maybe it's time to admit the land won. Maybe some battles aren't meant to be won. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the town's saying terrible things. About you. About her. I know. They're saying you sold yourself, that she bought you like livestock. Let them say it. Elias, what do you want me to do, Tom? Defend myself? Explain that it's more complicated than that? They wouldn't listen. They don't want to listen. Elias looked at Ellen's grave, at the stone that marked everything he'd lost. I did what I had to do, for June, for myself. And if that makes me a whore in their eyes, then so be it. Tom put his hat back on. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a whore. I think you're desperate. And I think desperation makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make you think. Tom started walking back toward his horse, then stopped. But I'll tell you something else. That woman, Vivian Song, she's got more backbone than half the men in this town. And if she chose you, desperate or not, maybe you should stop questioning it and start accepting it. He rode off before Elias could respond. Elias stayed at the farm until afternoon, walking through the house one last time, saying goodbye to ghosts. Then he mounted Sam and rode back to Prospect Hill, back to the big white house that was his home now, whether he felt like it or not. Vivian was in the garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil. She'd changed out of her fine dresses into something plain and practical, and her hair was coming loose from its pins. She looked up when she heard the horse shaded her eyes. You went to the farm, she said. Yes. How was it? Dead. He dismounted, tied Sam to the fence. Someone broke in, smashed what we left behind. Vivian's mouth tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's just things. He walked closer, looked at what she was doing. She'd planted new roses, a whole row of them along the fence. These are new. I thought the garden could use more color. She sat back on her heels. And I needed something to do with my hands. You could hire someone to do this. I could, but I like doing it myself. She pulled off her gloves, stood up. Mr. Mercer, Elias, we need to talk. About what? About this. She gestured between them. This arrangement, it's not working. Elias felt his stomach drop. You're having regrets. No. But you are. Vivian's eyes were sharp, seeing. You walk around this house like you're trespassing. You barely speak at meals. You disappear for hours and come back looking haunted. She crossed her arms. This isn't what I wanted, and I don't think it's what you wanted either. I don't know what I want. Then figure it out. Because I won't live with a ghost, Elias. I've done that already. My husband died 5 years ago. And I spent those 5 years living in this house alone, talking to memories, pretending it was enough. Her voice shook slightly. I married you so I wouldn't have to do that anymore. But if you're going to stay locked in your head, mourning your old life, then this was all for nothing. The words hit like a slap. Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? She was right. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. Don't know how to be married to someone I barely know. Don't know how to live in this house, in this life. It doesn't fit. Then make it fit. Vivian stepped closer. Or at least try. That's all I'm asking. Try. I am trying. Are you? She held his gaze. Because from where I'm standing, you're just going through the motions. Sitting at my table, sleeping under my roof. But you're not here. Not really. Elias felt anger flare. What do you want from me? You said this was an arrangement, companionship, partnership. You said you didn't expect love. I don't, but I expect presence. I expect you to at least look at me when we eat dinner instead of staring at your plate like it holds the answers to the universe. Vivian's voice rose. I expect conversation, Elias, real conversation, not weather reports and polite nothings. Fine, you want conversation? Elias stepped closer, his own voice rising to match hers. Let's talk about how your whole town hates me now, how they won't sell me food or look me in the eye, how someone threw a rock through my window with a note calling me a whore. Let's talk about how I had to abandon the only home I've ever known, the land my family's worked for 3 generations, because staying there meant watching my daughter starve. Is that the kind of conversation you want? Yes, Vivian said fiercely. Yes, that's exactly what I want. I want you angry. I want you hurt. I want you something other than this polite stranger who says thank you and please and acts like he's a guest in his own home. They stood there, both breathing hard, the space between them crackling with something Elias couldn't name. Then Vivian turned away, pulled her gloves back on. I'm going to finish planting these roses, she said, her voice calmer now. You can help, or you can go back to wandering around feeling sorry for yourself. Your choice. What fun. She knelt back down in the dirt, and after a moment, Elias knelt beside her. I don't know anything about roses, he said. Then I'll teach you. She handed him a small shovel. Dig here, about a foot deep. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of metal on dirt and the distant call of birds. Elias's hands, calloused from farm work, found the rhythm easily. Dig, plant, water, move on. Simple, honest work. My husband never gardened, Vivian said suddenly. Never understood why I wanted to. He thought it was beneath us, hiring help for manual labor. She patted dirt around a new plant. But I grew up helping my mother in her garden. It was the only place she seemed happy, the only place where she wasn't trying to be someone she wasn't. Who was she trying to be? A society lady, a proper wife, everything my father wanted her to be. Vivian's hand stilled. She died when I was 16, and all I have left of her are the things she taught me in that garden. How to choose good soil, how to prune without killing, how to be patient. Elias understood then. The garden wasn't just about beauty, it was about memory, about keeping something alive. Ellen loved roses, he said quietly. We tried to grow them at the farm. They'd bloom for a few weeks, then die. The soil was too hard, the water too scarce. She'd cry every time they withered. He dug another hole. I tried everything. Different varieties, different locations. Nothing worked. In the end, I stopped trying. Broke her heart a little, I think. Vivian looked at him. What color did she like? Pink, pale pink, like sunrise. There's a variety called Queen Elizabeth. Pale pink, very hardy, blooms twice a year if you treat it right. She paused. I could plant some, if you'd like. Elias felt something shift in his chest. Yeah, I'd like that. They planted until the sun started to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. When they were done, Vivian stood up, brushed dirt from her dress, and looked at the row of new roses with satisfaction. There, she said. Something growing instead of dying. They might not make it. They might not. But at least we tried. She met his eyes. That's all we can do, Elias. Try. He nodded, understanding she wasn't just talking about roses anymore. That night at dinner, Elias asked Vivian about her childhood in Philadelphia. She told him about the narrow streets and the tall buildings, about her father's shipping business, and her mother's garden that somehow survived in a tiny courtyard. She asked him about his father, and he told her about a quiet man who'd worked himself to death, trying to prove the land was worth saving. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was something. Later, lying in bed in his room, Elias heard Vivian moving around in hers through the thin wall, heard her footsteps, heard water pouring, heard the creak of bed springs, the sounds of another person living alongside him. Not with him, not yet, but alongside. It was a start. The next morning he woke to shouting. Elias pulled on his pants and ran downstairs to find Mrs. Chen standing in the kitchen doorway, gesturing wildly and speaking rapid Chinese. Vivian was already there, still in her nightgown with a robe thrown over it, her face pale. What's wrong? Elias demanded. Vivian pointed toward the yard. Someone was here, during the night. He went outside. The new roses they'd planted yesterday had been torn up, thrown across the lawn. The dirt was scattered, the roots exposed and drying in the morning sun. And written in the dirt with a stick or a finger was one word: leave. June appeared on the porch, rubbing sleep from her eyes. When she saw the destruction, she gasped. "Who did this?" she asked. "Who do you think?" Vivian's voice was hard as iron. "The same people who threw a rock through your window. The same people who won't sell us food or speak to us in the street." Elias felt rage build in his chest, hot and choking. "I'll find out who—" "No!" Vivian caught his arm. "You'll do nothing. That's what they want. They want you angry, want you making a scene so they can say you're violent, so they can justify whatever they do next. So we just let them get away with this? No, we plant new roses, we clean this up, and we refuse to leave." Vivian's eyes blazed. "This is my home, our home, and I'm not abandoning it because small-minded people can't handle a woman making her own choices." They spent the morning replanting. It was harder this time, knowing someone had deliberately destroyed their work, but they did it anyway. Elias, Vivian, June, and Mrs. Chen, all of them working together, defying the hate with simple, stubborn persistence. By noon, the roses were back in the ground. They looked fragile, wounded, but alive. "They'll come back," June said, looking at the replanted row. "Probably," Vivian agreed. "Then why bother?" "Because giving up means they win." Vivian put her arm around June's shoulders. "And I don't lose. Not to bullies." That afternoon, a man rode up to the house. Elias didn't recognize him at first. Dusty clothes, weathered face, riding a horse that had seen better days. Then the man removed his hat, and Elias saw it was Jack Morrison, who owned the hardware store in town. "Mr. Mercer," Morrison said. "Mrs. Song, got a minute?" "Depends on what you want," Elias said warily. Morrison dismounted, looked uncomfortable. "I heard what happened, the roses and such, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." Vivian crossed her arms. "Sorry for what exactly?" "For how folks have been treating you. It's not right." Morrison shifted his weight. "Look, I'm not saying I understand your arrangement or agree with it, but you're entitled to make your own choices. And destroying property, sending threats, that's not how decent people behave." "Did you do it?" Elias asked bluntly. "Were you here last night?" "No, but I know who was." Morrison's jaw tightened. "It was Margaret Dalton's son and some of his friends. They were bragging about it at the saloon this morning. I told them they were cowards, nearly came to blows over it." Vivian's expression didn't change. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because someone needs to. Because this has gone too far." Morrison put his hat back on. "I won't pretend to like what you've done, Mrs. Song, but I respect it. Takes courage to go against the grain. And Elias, you're a good man. Always have been. Doesn't matter who you married or why." "Thank you," Elias said quietly. Morrison nodded, started to mount his horse, then stopped. "One more thing. If you need supplies, come to my store. I'll serve you. Might catch hell for it, but I'll do it anyway." He rode off before they could respond. Vivian watched him go, then turned to Elias. "Well," she said, "at least one person in this town has a spine. One's better than none." That night they sat together in the parlor after June had gone to bed. Vivian had a book in her lap but wasn't reading it. Elias sat across from her, watching the shadows move on the wall. "Tell me about the farm," Vivian said suddenly. "What about it?" "Why you can't let it go." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Because it's all I have left of them. My father, my grandfather, Ellen." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That land, it's soaked in their sweat, their blood, their hopes. And I failed them. Failed to keep it alive." "You didn't fail. The drought failed. The economy failed. You just ran out of ways to fight." "Same thing." "It's not," Vivian set her book aside. "Elias, that farm is dying because the well is running dry. Not because you're not strong enough or smart enough or dedicated enough. Because the water's gone. If I'd had money for a deeper well, then you wouldn't have needed to marry me." Vivian's voice was gentle but firm. And we wouldn't be sitting here right now. Sometimes things happen the way they're supposed to, even if it doesn't feel that way. Elias looked at her. You really believe that? I have to. Otherwise, I spent 5 years alone in this house for no reason. Otherwise, my husband died for nothing. Otherwise, everything is just random chaos. She stood up, moved to the window. I choose to believe there's a pattern, even if I can't see it yet. Must be nice, Elias said, not unkindly. Having that kind of faith. It's not faith, it's survival. Vivian turned to face him. The alternative is despair, and I refuse to live there. Later, as Elias lay in bed, he thought about what she'd said, about patterns and purpose and refusing despair. Thought about the roses they'd replanted, about Morrison riding out to apologize, about June humming in the kitchen. Maybe Vivian was right. Maybe this was the pattern. Maybe all of it. The drought, the poverty, the humiliation, the desperate marriage. Maybe it was all leading somewhere he couldn't see yet. Or maybe it was just chaos, and they were making the best of it. Either way, the roses would bloom or they wouldn't. The town would accept them or it wouldn't. And he and Vivian would figure out how to live together or they wouldn't. But at least they were trying. And for now, that had to be enough. The roses lasted 3 days before someone destroyed them again. This time, they didn't just pull them up, they burned them. Elias woke to the smell of smoke and ran outside to find charred stems and ash scattered across the garden. Vivian stood in her nightgown, staring at the destruction, her face carved from stone. Enough, she said. Vivian? No. Enough. She turned to him, and her eyes were cold fire. I'm going to the sheriff. The sheriff won't do anything. Margaret Dalton's husband probably owns him. Then I'll go to the newspaper. I'll go to the county seat. I'll make enough noise that someone has to listen. She walked toward the house, her bare feet leaving prints in the ash. This is arson. It's criminal destruction of property, and I'm not letting it stand. But before she could act, something else happened. That afternoon, a wagon rolled up to the house. Not one wagon, 3. Elias recognized the first driver immediately, Jack Morrison from the hardware store. Behind him came Thomas Brennan and his wife Martha. And in the third wagon, a family Elias didn't know, their clothes simple but clean. Morrison climbed down, gestured to the others. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer. He still stumbled over Vivian's new name. We heard what happened, came to help. Help with what? Elias asked. Replanting, rebuilding, whatever needs doing. Morrison looked at the burned roses, his expression grim. This has gone too far. And some of us, we're tired of standing by while decent people get terrorized. Martha Brennan stepped forward, carrying a basket. I brought food and some cuttings from my own garden, hardy stock. Takes more than fire to kill them. The family Elias didn't know introduced themselves as the Johnsons. They ran a small farm north of town, kept to themselves mostly. We know what it's like, mister, Johnson said quietly. Being outsiders. My wife's Mexican. Town's never fully accepted us. So when we heard what they're doing to you, he shrugged, figured we'd stand with you. Vivian stood on the porch, her hand pressed to her mouth. When she lowered it, her voice was thick. You don't have to do this. They'll turn on you too. Let them, Morrison said. I'm tired of being scared of Margaret Dalton and her gossip circle. I'm tired of watching good people suffer because they don't fit into neat little boxes. He picked up a shovel from his wagon. Now where do you want these roses? They worked all afternoon. Morrison, Brennan, Johnson, their wives, even their children. They cleared the burned stems, prepared new soil, planted cutting after cutting. June helped, her hands dirty, her face bright with something Elias realized was hope. Mrs. Chen brought out lemonade and cookies, her usual stern expression softening as she watched the garden come back to life. Elias worked alongside them, feeling something in his chest unclench for the first time since the wedding. These people didn't know him well, didn't owe him anything. But they were here anyway, their hands in the dirt, their backs to the town that would surely punish them for this kindness. As the sun started to set, Morrison straightened, wiped his brow. That should do it. 3 times the roses you had before. Let's see them try to burn all these. Thank you, Vivian said. The words seemed inadequate, but her voice carried weight. I won't forget this. Just treat Elias right, Morrison said with a small smile. That's thanks enough. After they left, Elias and Vivian stood in the garden, looking at the rows of new plantings. The smell of fresh earth hung in the air, rich and promising. I didn't think anyone would come, Vivian said quietly. Neither did I. Maybe the town isn't all bad, just mostly bad. Elias touched one of the new stems, gentle. But maybe that's enough. A few good people in a sea of bad ones. That night, June asked if she could stay up late. She had something to say, she told them, and it couldn't wait. They gathered in the parlor, Elias, Vivian, and June, and the girl stood in front of them like she was giving a speech. I've been thinking, she began, about Ma, about what she'd want. Elias tensed. June, let me finish, Pa, please. June took a breath. Ma loved you, I know that. I remember how she'd look at you when you came in from the fields, like you were the whole world. Her voice wavered but held. But she's gone, and you're not. And Mrs. Song, she looked at Vivian. You're not trying to replace Ma. I can see that. You're just trying to be you. Where are you going with this? Elias asked gently. I'm saying it's okay. What you did. Marrying her, moving here, all of it. June's eyes were bright. I was angry at first, thought you were giving up on Ma's memory, but you're not. You're just trying to live, and Ma would want that. She'd want you to be happy. Vivian made a small sound, quickly suppressed. I'm not happy yet, Elias said honestly. Don't know if I will be, but I'm trying. We both are. I know. June smiled, and it was Ellen's smile, bright and fierce, and that's enough. She went to bed, leaving Elias and Vivian alone in the lamplight. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of June's words settling around them. She's wise, Vivian said finally. Wiser than either of us. Gets it from her mother. And her father. Vivian looked at him. You're a good man, Elias Mercer. I hope you know that. I'm a desperate man who married for money. You're a devoted father who did what he had to do to protect his child. There's a difference. She stood, moved toward the stairs, then paused. For what it's worth, I don't regret this. Any of it. Not even the burned roses? Not even those. She climbed the stairs, and Elias heard her door close softly. He sat in the dark for a while longer, thinking about what June had said, about trying being enough, about living instead of just surviving. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd forgotten to see what he'd gained. The next morning brought disaster of a different kind. Elias was in the barn checking on Sam when he heard Vivian cry out. He ran to the house, found her in the kitchen, a letter crumpled in her hand. What's wrong? She handed him the letter without a word. It was from her banker in Philadelphia, formal and apologetic. Due to recent investments gone bad, her accounts were significantly depleted. She wasn't destitute, the letter assured her, but her circumstances had changed considerably. She would need to economize. How bad? Elias asked. Bad enough. Vivian sat down heavily. I have the house, some savings, but the income I was counting on, it's gone. Bad railroad stock. My late husband's partner made poor choices with the trust. Elias felt cold spread through him. So you're not wealthy anymore, not the way I was. She laughed, but it came out bitter. Ironic, isn't it? You married me for money, and now there's barely any. I didn't. Elias stopped. That wasn't true. He had married her partly for the money. They both knew it. What will you do? Vivian asked, and her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. Now that I can't provide the way I promised? Elias looked at this woman who'd saved him, who'd stood up to the whole town, who'd replanted roses 3 times just to prove she wouldn't be broken. Looked at her sitting there, vulnerable and scared, thinking he'd leave her now that the money was gone. And something in him shifted, something fundamental. I'm going to the farm, he said. What? The well. You remember you said it just needed to go deeper? He was already moving toward the door. I'm going to find out if you were right. He rode to the farm, then kept going, past it to Thomas Brennan's place. Tom was in his barn, and he looked surprised to see Elias. Need your help, Elias said without preamble. Know anyone who digs wells? There's a crew that comes through sometimes, expensive though. How expensive? Tom named a figure that made Elias wince. He didn't have that kind of money. Vivian didn't have it anymore either. But, Tom said slowly, I might know another way. Old Charlie Thompson, he used to dig wells before his back gave out. Still has the equipment. Might be willing to supervise if we provide the labor. We? You think I'm going to let you do this alone? Tom grinned. Besides, I've always wondered if there was water deeper down on your land. Good excuse to find out. They gathered a crew. Tom, Morrison, Johnson, even a few other men who'd heard about the rose burning and were quietly disgusted by it. Charlie Thompson came, grizzled and bent but sharp-eyed, and walked Elias's property with a divining rod. Here, he said finally, pointing to a spot 50 yards from the old well. Here's where you dig, and you go deep, 40 feet, maybe 50. But the water's there. I can feel it. They started digging the next morning. It was brutal work. The ground was hard as concrete, the sun merciless. They worked in shifts, one man down in the growing hole, others hauling dirt, bringing water, offering encouragement. Vivian came to watch, brought food and cold drinks. June helped too, keeping track of measurements. Taking notes like this was a scientific expedition. You don't have to do this, Vivian told Elias on the second day. The farm is dead. You said so yourself. Maybe it was, but maybe it just needed something I couldn't give it alone. He wiped sweat from his face. You said some things need to go deeper to survive. Let's see if you were right. They dug for 3 days, 20 feet, 30, 40. The hole got deeper and darker and still no water. Charlie Thompson kept insisting it was there, just a little farther, keep going. Some of the men started to grumble. This was a fool's errand, a waste of time. On the 4th day at 47 feet, the shovel hit something different. Not rock, not clay. Something that gave way with a sucking sound. Water, Charlie breathed. Pull him up now. They hauled the digger, Morrison's oldest son, up out of the hole. And then they heard it. A sound like breathing, like the earth exhaling. Water began to seep up from the bottom of the hole. Slowly at first, then faster. Step back, Charlie ordered. She's coming. They backed away from the hole. The water rose and rose. And then, with a sound like thunder, it burst up from the ground, spraying into the air, catching the sunlight, throwing rainbows across the dusty field. Clear water, cold water, abundant water. The men cheered. June screamed with joy. Tom pounded Elias on the back so hard he nearly fell over. And Vivian stood there, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Elias walked to her through the spray, through the mud forming from dust and water, through the chaos of celebration. He took her hands, and they were shaking. You were right, he said. It just needed to go deeper. I was talking about roses, she whispered. I know. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw what he'd been too blind to see before. This woman who'd asked him an impossible question in a general store. Who'd saved him not with charity, but with dignity. Who'd stood beside him against the whole town, replanted roses 3 times, and never once asked him to be anything other than himself. I need to tell you something, he said. What? When I married you, it was for the wrong reasons. For security, for June, for survival. His voice was rough. But somewhere along the way, that changed. And I didn't even notice until today, standing here watching water come up from the ground because you believed it would. Elias, let me finish. I don't know if what I feel is love. Don't know if I even remember what love feels like anymore. But I know I want to sit across from you at dinner. Want to hear your voice. Want to work beside you in the garden. He squeezed her hands. Money or no money, town or no town, I'm not going anywhere. Because you're not just my wife on paper anymore. You're my partner, and I choose you. Vivian's tears came harder now. I choose you too, she said. I chose you from the beginning. I just didn't know if you'd ever choose me back. They stood there in the spray from the well, in the middle of the dead farm that wasn't quite dead anymore, and Elias pulled her close. Not in passion, not in romance, but in something deeper, recognition, partnership, 2 broken people deciding to be whole together. The men built a proper wellhead over the next few days, installed a pump, ran tests to make sure the water would keep flowing. And it did. The aquifer Charlie had found was deep and full, enough to water the entire farm, and then some. You could sell this water, Tom said, to other farms. Make a profit. Maybe, Elias said. Or maybe we just grow things again. See what happens. He and Vivian decided to keep both properties. The farm would be for working. Elias would plant again come spring, see if the land could be brought back from the edge. The house on Prospect Hill would be home. They'd split their time between both, June going to school in town, all of them finding a rhythm that fit. The town didn't suddenly embrace them. Margaret Dalton still crossed the street when she saw them. The Reverend still preached about the sanctity of marriage in ways clearly aimed at them. But there were others now. Morrison, Brennan, Johnson, and their families. People who waved when they passed, who stopped to talk, who slowly, grudgingly, accepted that Elias and Vivian weren't going anywhere. One evening, 2 months after the well came in, Elias walked out to the garden and found Vivian kneeling among the roses. They'd survived, all of them. The pale pink Queen Elizabeths were blooming, their petals soft in the fading light. "For Ellen," Vivian said, touching one of the blooms. "Like you asked, thank you. Do you still miss her?" "Every day." Elias knelt beside Vivian. "But it's different now. Less like drowning, more like remembering. She was part of my life, a big part, but she's not my whole life anymore." "Good." Vivian leaned against him just slightly. "Because you're part of mine now, and I'd like to keep you for a while." "How long? How does the rest of our lives sound?" "Sounds about right." June came out then carrying a book, her feet bare and her dress hem-muddy from helping Mrs. Chen in the vegetable garden. She saw them sitting together and smiled. "Did you tell him yet?" she asked Vivian. "Tell me what?" Elias looked between them. Vivian's cheeks colored slightly. "I've been thinking about doing something with the money I have left. Something useful." "What kind of something?" "A school. Here, on the property. For children whose families can't afford regular schooling." She spoke faster now, excited. "June gave me the idea. She said there are kids in town who can't read, can't write, who work instead of learn. I thought, maybe we could change that." Elias looked at his wife, and she was truly his wife now, not just on paper, and felt something like pride swell in his chest. "You want to teach them." "We'd hire teachers, build a proper schoolhouse, maybe even offer room and board for families who can't make the daily trip." She was animated now, her hands moving as she talked. "It wouldn't be charity. We'd charge what people could afford, even if it's just labor or produce or—" "It's a good idea," Elias interrupted. "A great idea." "Really? Really?" He stood, pulled her up with him. "You wanted to make a difference. This is how you do it, not by having money, but by using what you have to help people who need it." June cheered. Vivian kissed him, quick and impulsive, then pulled back, embarrassed. Elias laughed and kissed her again, slower this time, meaning it. "Well," June said, "it's about time." They built the school that winter. A small building at first, just one room with a stove and desks Morrison built at cost. They hired a teacher from back east, a young woman who believed education was a right, not a privilege. By spring, they had 12 students. By summer, 20. The town complained, of course. Said Vivian was putting on airs again, trying to make herself seem important. But the families who sent their children didn't care what the town said. Their kids were learning. That was what mattered. Elias planted wheat on the farm that spring. The water from the new well ran clear and strong, feeding irrigation ditches he dug with his own hands and help from his growing circle of allies. The wheat came up green and healthy, and when harvest time came, the yield was the best the land had seen in a decade. He sold half the crop, kept half for replanting. Used the money to hire workers for the next season, to fix up the old farmhouse, to buy June a new dress that actually fit. And every evening he came home to the house on Prospect Hill, where Vivian waited with supper and conversation, where June read in the library or helped Mrs. Chen with dinner, where the garden bloomed in defiance of everything the town had tried to do to them. One night, lying in bed, the same bed now because somewhere along the way they'd stopped needing separate rooms, Vivian asked him, "Do you ever regret it, saying yes that day?" "Which day? When you proposed in the store, or when I showed up at your door ready to sell my soul?" "Either. Both." Elias thought about it, about the humiliation, the struggle, the roses burned and replanted, about finding water 47 feet down, about learning to see this woman not as a solution to his problems, but as a person worth knowing, worth choosing, worth loving in whatever complicated way they'd built together. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it, any of it. Not even the parts where I was difficult? Especially those parts kept me from feeling sorry for myself." He pulled her closer. "What about you? Regret marrying a broke farmer with a smart mouth and a dead farm?" "The farm's not dead anymore." You know what I mean." Vivian was quiet for a moment, then, "I regret that it took so long for you to see me, but I don't regret waiting. Some things are worth waiting for. Like water from a deep well." Exactly like that. They fell asleep like that, tangled together. Two people who'd started as strangers, bound by desperation, and become something neither of them had expected. Not a fairy tale, not perfect, but real. Honest. Enough. The roses bloomed every year after that. Sometimes they died back in hard winters, but they always came back in spring. Pale pink Queen Elizabeths for Ellen's memory. Deep red climbers for Vivian's mother. White tea roses just because they were beautiful. The school grew. The farm prospered. June grew up smart and strong. Went to college back east on money Elias and Vivian saved together. Came back with ideas about improving crop rotation and teaching methods. And Elias and Vivian grew old together, their partnership deepening into something that looked a lot like love. Even if neither of them called it that. They sat across from each other at dinner every night, talked about the day, the students, the crops, the weather. They worked in the garden side by side. They made decisions together, fought occasionally, made up always. They were never fully accepted by everyone in Millridge. Margaret Dalton went to her grave thinking Vivian was a foreign interloper, and Elias was a man who'd sold himself. But enough people came around, enough to matter, enough to build a community, that the hate started to feel small and distant, like something from another life. Years later, when people asked how they'd met, Elias would say, "She asked me a question in a general store, and I was too stunned to say no." And Vivian would add, "He was too stubborn to admit he needed help. I had to drag him into happiness." And June, grown and wise, would smile and say, "They saved each other. That's all that matters." Because that was the truth in the end. Not that Vivian had saved Elias or that he'd given her the companionship she craved, but that they'd saved each other. Two broken people in a hard world, choosing to be less broken together. It wasn't the story Elias thought he'd have. Wasn't the life he'd planned when he married Ellen under that oak tree with wildflowers in her hair. But it was good. It was honest. It was his. And standing in the garden one evening in their later years, roses blooming all around them, water from the deep well keeping everything alive, Elias Mercer looked at his wife and understood what he'd been too hurt to see at the beginning. Sometimes the best things in life come from the deepest places. Sometimes you have to dig through rock and clay and desperation to find what you really need. Sometimes the question that seems impossible is actually the answer you've been waiting for. And sometimes, just sometimes, choosing to try is the bravest thing you can do. The roses kept blooming, the water kept flowing, and two people who'd met in desperation kept choosing each other day after day, year after year, until choosing became as natural as breathing. That was their story. Not perfect, not easy, but theirs. And in the end, that was more than enough.